Well, thanks so much for joining us. We'll just wait a couple minutes as we have more participants entering our discussion now. All right, well, thanks for joining. My name is Wade Croft and I lead the Natural Resources Agency, and I'm the host for today's speaker series event. These are discussions where we bring big thinkers, proactive leaders from across the state on topics that matter to us at our agency and in the Newsom administration, and hopefully to you. And that is everything from climate resilience to biodiversity to equitable public access. And today I'm really glad to be joined by some remarkable leaders and doers on a topic that is very important. And that is, of course, how do we reintroduce so-called ecological fire in the age of climate change? Today we have with us Craig Thomas from the Fire Restoration Group, who's been leading this work for decades. Bill Tripp, the Director of Natural Resources at the Karuk Tribe. Laina Quinn Davidson, a fire ecologist at the UC Ag and Natural Resources Extension, and recognized as a leader on these topics. And Chief Tom Porter, who of course leads Calfire. We also later in our discussion have a very special guest in Senator Bill Dodd, who has been a trailblazer on law changes to actually expand our work building our resilience to catastrophic wildfire. And he'll talk about a bill that he authored this year that has direct impact on this topic of good fire. So I've been on a journey over the last decade and a half to really understand what wildfire means to California. And I'll concede, when I moved to California from the Midwest in my 30s, I should say my early 20s, wildfires were something to be avoided. And we talked, my early understanding of California wildfires is we don't want them. But of course, as all of us have learned more about the wildfire challenge in California, we know the actually opposite is true, which is our landscapes, our ecology need fire. That fire is a natural part of that landscape towards keeping our lands and ecosystems healthy, and to reduce the risk of small fires becoming very large and catastrophic. So much has been talked about around what are the contributing factors to what we face right now, which is truly a catastrophic wildfire crisis. We know that the vast majority of the large fires have happened not only in the last 20 years, but in the last 5 years. We have fire conditions across our landscapes more dangerous than ever. This wildfire season, for the first time in the state's history, wildfires burned so big and so hot, they crested the Sierra Nevada summit and moved into the eastern Sierra Nevada. And that is, of course, the Dixie and the Caldor fires. We know that climate change is a contributing factor. Those warming temperatures in the winter, warming temperatures in the spring and summer that create more challenging wildfire conditions. But we also know that we have a century-plus legacy of fire exclusion from our landscapes in California, keeping fire off the landscapes, not doing the level of active management that tribal communities practiced for thousands of years that really bring us to the current situation. Now, as daunting as the catastrophic wildfire crisis is, I am actually energized and encouraged because the legislature, the governor, have stepped up in some really important ways that we'll talk about, not least of which is $1.5 billion of investment to build our wildfire resilience, including expanding this so-called good fire. So what we're trying to do today is really learn from experts that have been focused on this for a long time and integrate you into the conversation. We'll hear first from our panelists, short thoughts that each of them have, and then we'll bring ourselves back onto the screen and invite you to ask questions or provide comments that will filter to the participants. You can do that by touching the button on your screen that says Q&A, and at any point you can pose a question as you're listening to our presentations. There are several hundred of us here today. This has been clearly a really popular topic, and big thanks to all of you who are joining. I think we'll all learn something here today. So let me first introduce Craig Thomas. And again, I let you know that Craig Thomas leads the Fire Restoration Group and has been a guiding light on the good fire movement for a very long time. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Wade. Thanks for the invitation. So the first thing I want to mention to folks is that we're talking about good fire today, but no way are we minimizing the suffering and the occurrences of the recent fire season, people in Grizzly Flat, people in Greenville and other parts of the state. But today we're talking about the other side of the coin and the possibilities for good fire to limit the extent of the unfortunate things that we're seeing happening here on an annual basis. So just want to be clear, we all feel that what you've all been through has been terrible, and you have our empathy and regard for what you've gone through. But today we're talking about good fire. So how do we know what's good and what's bad? Well, one of the ways we know that is by understanding the fire regime, fire frequency, and the fire return interval in our state. A state which is one of 6 of the most naturally fire-prone landscapes on Earth. And so part of what we know and what this map shows here is a color coding that demonstrates departure. So if we had a fire regime, talking in a generality here of every 10 to 15 years in the Sierra Nevada, and we've gone 100 years without fire on the land, we would be considered seriously departed from the natural system that was operating into the 18th century. So that departure, or that fire return interval departure, is a way we measure. If we haven't missed too many intervals of natural fire, we're in okay shape. If we've missed 100 years, we're in rough shape. So we want to get back to good fire and mimicking the natural system that has been in place here for thousands of years. Next slide. So natural disturbance processes, part of what really matters here is how we think about this landscape we live in. And so when even the word disturbance process is, it's not my cherished word, it's ecological processes that operate on our landscape: wind, fire, rain. We don't get many volcanoes or hurricanes, but we get a lot of precipitation when we're lucky, and we're in a period where we get less now, and we're getting more fire, much of it the type we don't want, and we want to turn that situation around dramatically. So this is just some pictures of what we are all too familiar with. I don't mean to increase anybody's anxiety level, but looking at wind speeds and red flag warnings seem to be a part of the deal now, but it's not unnatural. So fire and rain are the 2 fundamental ecological processes that define the state we live in: fire and precipitation. And they both provide benefits, and they can be rough to deal with at the same time. We want more of the good. And next slide. Just a couple of other ways to measure where we're at. The table on the right is based on vegetation need for fire, and it's roughly 550,000 acres annually in the Sierra Nevada on the Forest Service and National Park lands alone. So that means vegetation evolving over the millennia with fire as a regular natural process. So you could look at it as this is what vegetation needs to resemble the things we're used to seeing on the landscape. That's a lot of acres for just the Sierra Nevada federal ownership. One of the other challenges that is, as we're thinking about pace and scale and wanting to get more treatments on the land, how much we can do mechanically, where we need to use those treatments in places where we want to safeguard and not risk communities. We want to get pre-treatment done before we think about lighting off a big landscape around a town, totally understandable. But this graph is from Malcolm North also, and it's a constraints paper from 2015, and it basically shows how much land, roughly, I mean, we could debate the percentage numbers here and there, but roughly how much land is available for mechanical. But then the other constraints, legal, operational, administrative, the operational one is very interesting because it's a mountain range. And there's a lot of places we will never see mechanical treatment that are still really important values for recreation, for habitat, for water quality protection, and a variety of things like that. If we don't have an active fire program on those landscapes, and if we don't maintain the rest of what we do proactively, we're missing a huge opportunity, and we're writing off more acres than we could even stand to talk about. So we need that fire program for a variety of reasons. One is to get to the places we can't get to any other way. Next slide. Talking about big changes, one of them is to expand fire use in California. And if we're going to do longer duration, larger landscapes, like we say we need to do, we're going to need a management system that supports burning in remote areas on steep ground and outside the predictive capacity of our meteorological resources. So what does that mean? That means if you're lighting fire at 50 to 100 acres over a couple of days, you got your small crew and you're doing that work, we are not going to get to the scale we need to get to a fire restoration in California. We need to burn for weeks at a time, not a few days at a time. So that partnership with meteorology is one of our more challenging things. How do we know what's coming down the line in terms of weather when we're burning in steep ground? And we need to complete that work to get the benefits. And we are not terribly certain about what the weather is going to hold up to be. So that's one of the places a lot of us are working on, is trying to refine that and better understand that, working together with air regulators and fire managers to have the crews we need and the understanding we need to burn large landscapes. Next slide. Heard a lot of talk in my career about we can't do first entry burns. That's actually not correct. This is just one picture I was invited to in 1998, believe it or not, Patterson Mountain in the Dinky Creek watershed, burning on January 3rd. Burned the next year, roughly on January 3rd.
Hey, Craig, what's an entry burn for those of us who don't know?
Well, first entry burns would mean you burn before you do mechanical treatments. So you're burning that natural landscape as it is. And so that is has to be done carefully and thoughtfully. And this individual was famous for being able to do that, but he's burning in January. And that means you have to be available in January. You have to have the crew size, you have to have the air quality permission, the things that you need to be able to do first entry burns. You don't do that in downtown Placerville or Nevada City. You do that out in the wildlands in the right season with the right people who are available. And that was the intention of this individual. Next slide, please. Just a quick note here, ecological integrity is a major guidepost for the Forest Service in their forest plans across the United States and in California. And one of the main attributes is to enhance and establish ecological integrity, maintain, restore structure, function, composition, and connectivity. Structure, think about the trees in the photograph. Function is processes like fire. Composition is biodiversity. Think about that. We have Governor Brown and Governor Newsom have both offered biodiversity initiatives in California. Fire is a major driver of biodiversity in California. And the other thing that matters for ecological integrity is connectivity. So if you have a bunch of fragmented little pieces where animals can't move in between and expand populations, then we start limiting the population size, whether it's plants or animals, without connectivity. So ecological integrity is a big deal. Next slide, please. What we need to change, this is pretty much the last one here, all hands and all lands collaboration. I love this photograph because it's on the High Sierra Ranger District with the Fresno Kings Calfire unit and collaborative work with Southern California Edison and the High Sierra District burning together. Nowhere else in the state do I know of a partnership like exists down there, and that's the thing we need to grow. particularly if we want to support larger, longer burns. We need to significantly expand the permanent fire restoration workforce. And that's a big challenge that we could talk about for a month, but we need a workforce. We know we've exhausted our fire suppression folks who we rely on to do a lot of our restorative burning. So we need to have a workforce that's more fluid and expanded, that can go back and forth when they need to be able to do the fire lighting we need. Lower risk aversion, that's always a challenge. We need all the available tools if we're going to restore this landscape and build resilience. So that support for land managers that are willing to do large scale burns is critical. We need more science-based fire communication, which I think we really do a great job with. Calfire, Forest Service, NGOs, air regulators are all speaking truthfully and scientifically about fire need. The broader collaboration with air regulators is really important. We have in our fire MOU partnership, Butte County, Placer County, and El Dorado County, and we've added the California Air Resources Board to our 35-member partnership. Nowhere else in the country is that happening. So good on all of us. Heterogeneity, big long word, but what it means is variability. That's what equals resilience. If we have uniformity, whether it's stand structure or fuel continuity, if we have stuff on the ground, ladder fuels, fire gets up into trees, we need to break those systems up using fire and other tools so that we can gain more resilience. Resilience is our product. If we behave ourselves, there's a lot of other benefits we can get from the landscape we live on, but thinking less about commodification and more about resilience is the way to get there, including how we reforest. We need to reforest like fire matters and add the values of gratitude, reciprocity, and nurturing mentality in our value set. And that's just a general thing that recognize this planet supports us, and we have to have some grace in terms of learning how to live here. And that's why I applaud the state and the federal agencies and all of our NGO partners coming together, recognizing that how we have lived needs to change into something different. Last slide. I'll leave you with this. Our former governor nailed it. If you have any questions or are interested in resources, there's my contact information if you can see it. Happy to talk with anybody offline later on and send files, whatever you'd like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Before we turn to colleagues, I wanted to ask you a question. You've been at this a long time, and I'm interested to know if you're sensing a sea change of acceptance, openness, interest in the idea of getting more ecologically based, low-level fire back on the landscape. Just honestly, where do you think the conversation is at?
I think it's from 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. I am continually astounded at the progress we've made and occasionally overwhelmed by how much more we need to do. But what we have is the California Senate and Assembly, the governor, Natural Resources Agency, the Forest Service, the Park Service, federal administration, NGOs all over the place. The media has gotten a lot better informed. So I think that whole package looks really good. I wish it would have been here 25 years ago.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, we're going to talk about some of the barriers that prevent us from doing what we all want to do. So let's turn to Laina Quinn Davidson, who is a fire ecologist at the UC Agricultural and Natural Resources Extension. Laina, thanks so much for being here. And just for those of us, who aren't aware of the UC Extension, maybe just share a few sentences about what you provide on behalf of the UC on this topic.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for including me today. I'm a fire advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and my focus is working on a lot of different things fire related, but really my passion is prescribed fire, or using fire as a beneficial tool. And I'm also the director of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council, which is a group that brings different entities together to tackle the barriers to prescribed fire. So I've worked on prescribed fire related issues for more than a decade. And I can honestly say that I've never seen such a pivotal moment as we are in now. So to answer that question that you just asked, Craig, we're really riding kind of a monumental wave of interest and excitement around prescribed fire right now, and around, good fire in general. I'd say landowners are beating down our doors to start prescribed burn associations and to implement projects. And the state is investing in unprecedented ways. And, folks from all different backgrounds, tribes, agencies, community members, NGOs are just so eager for opportunities to train and learn and to be engaged in this. So I see that people are really hungry for a good relationship with fire. And I personally can barely keep up with the amount of interest from the media and the public and policymakers. It's just such an incredible time and such a formative time to be working on prescribed fire in California. But I would say that these changes are not without growing pains. And I think in some ways we're really in an awkward period of transition in California as we try to reconsider and adjust our culture around fire. So during my little presentation here, I wanted to use my local efforts here in Humboldt County, where I'm based, as an illustration of some of the challenges we're facing currently, and then highlight the various legislative efforts that we've passed in recent years, and especially this year, that should allay some of those concerns and give us room to really grow this prescribed fire work. So here in Humboldt County, we formed the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association back in 2018. And at that time, it was the first PBA, or Prescribed Burn Association, in the Western US. And the PBA is essentially a community cooperative for prescribed fire. We have about 100 members from all different walks of life: ranchers, retired fire professionals, university students, environmental organizations and timber companies, back to the landers, you name it. We have everyone involved. It's really drawn the full community in. And we've implemented about 33 different prescribed fire projects in the last couple of years, and helped inspire 15 other prescribed burn associations across the state. So you can see that by any means, it's been a successful effort that's really drawn a lot of attention and interest. But it's interesting because this year, which has been so monumental in so many ways, we've actually really struggled to get our projects off the ground. And we have several projects that are planned and prepared and ready to go. But many of the burn bosses that we've usually worked with over the last couple of years have lost their insurance in the last year. And this isn't because they did anything wrong, but really because the insurance industry doesn't want anything to do with fire in California. And prescribed fire has become a victim of that as well. Likewise, here in Humboldt County, we have several highly qualified PBA members who took the first California State Certified Burn Boss class back in May when I hosted it here. But that process has been moving very slowly, and no one's been certified yet. And landowners are worried about liability in the absence of certified insured burn bosses. So our work hinges on the availability of one burn boss who is miraculously still insured, but he has to travel 6 hours from San Jose to come burn with us in Humboldt. And he's in demand all across the state because of this unique situation. So we're not the only group that faces these challenges. And in these ways, I just want to point out that we are simultaneously in one of the most exciting times for prescribed fire in California, but also one of the most frustrating. And it's like I said, just these growing pains and these kind of awkward periods of transition. But changes that took place this year and that are going to roll out in 2022 should really help us in big ways. I'm sure many of you know that a few weeks ago, Governor Newsom approved a $20 million appropriation to establish a prescribed fire claims fund. And this fund will act kind of like a state-backed insurance pool for prescribed fire. So it'll be able to cover damages in the very rare case that something goes wrong. And then just 2 weeks ago, Newsom signed Senate Bill 332 into law. And this was hugely exciting for me because it's something I worked very closely with Senator Dodd on. And it gives liability protections to prescribed burners and to cultural practitioners who are, using best management practices and doing work that benefits the public. So I am just super grateful to Senator Dodd for his leadership on that bill. It really tells prescribed fire practitioners the state is our partner and that it has our back as we do this critical work. And that is so important. Now, the State Certified Burn Boss program is another really critical piece of this puzzle. And I just want to say I'm so committed to seeing it be successful. It's something I really care about. I hope to host another class this winter and to make sure that the certification process moves forward efficiently and effectively, and with the full support of the state and Calfire. I think that's just so important that they're confident in the program and that they support its development. And I'm also really excited about some of the forthcoming energy around workforce development. The need for a prescribed fire training center has been called out in both federal legislation and in the recent Assembly Bill 642. And so I'm really hopeful that we can come up with a robust plan that can meet the diverse needs of our federal, state, cultural, and community-based partners. I think we're at a point where we know that the agencies can't do this work alone. They just can't. And all of these pieces and partners are absolutely essential to increasing prescribed fire in California. So just in closing, I want to thank Secretary Crowfoot for having me here today. And I really want to thank Senator Dodd and the other people on this panel for having been visionary leaders around prescribed fire. I think we can make it through these growing pains, but we have to stay focused on the people and the partnerships and the passion that makes prescribed fire happen in California. I know that might sound cheesy, but passion really is what drives prescribed fire. All the most amazing programs in California are driven by committed people who really care. So if we want to continue to support this work, we need to support innovative legislation, and we really need to make the institutional and cultural shifts that can better facilitate this work. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Laina, and looking forward to unpacking these growing pains and how we get through them. It is pretty remarkable. It seems like there's this convergence of recognition and priority, but we're trying to get this done in a system that wasn't built to do this. And so how do we change? Question I wanted to ask for you, as I said, I think we have about 350 people in this conversation, some of whom probably know a lot about this topic, others that may know hardly anything. So do you have a website, either your own website up there in Humboldt County, or where would somebody that doesn't know much about prescribed fire or how to get involved in this good fire movement in California, what informational resources might you suggest?
Yeah, there are a couple websites. So the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council has a website, so you can Google that and find it pretty easily. And that has some good background information on prescribed fire in general. There's also a website, calpba.org, and that is where we have all the different prescribed burn associations listed and other resources around prescribed fire and specifically community-based prescribed fire.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to talk to Bill Tripp. Bill, as I mentioned, is the Natural Resources Director at the Karuk tribe in far Northern California. And as I said in my introduction, what we're really working to do is restore a practice that has been on California's landscape since time immemorial, thanks to many tribal communities. And so much of this process is learning from our tribal partners. And Bill, I'm so thankful of your leadership and helping educate us and tell us sometimes what we need to do or how we get out of the way on this work. So welcome, and I'm interested in your thoughts broadly on this good fire movement and the role of the Karuk and tribal leadership in this effort.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I believe I have some slides coming up. I had a little technical difficulty. Our generator for the town Wi-Fi went down, so I'm glad I made it back. So fire that achieves socio-ecological resilience is good fire. Indigenous peoples have maintained such resilience for millennia. From an indigenous perspective, humans need fire just as much as the animals do. When used in the right places, for the right reasons, at the right times, many benefits are achieved. Resilient ecosystems are healthy ecosystems. We all too often get hung up on the socioeconomics to the point that what drives action tends to be about costs and returns on investment. By focusing on socio-ecological resilience, outcomes are right for the ecosystem, drive action, and returns are realized through accessing the byproducts of our work. Next slide, please. Good fire considers many factors. We must start thinking of humans as component of the ecosystems again, as the only species capable of manipulating fire. On the Somes Bar Integrated Wildland Fire Management Project, one of the focal species we must learn from is the Pacific giant salamander. In Karuk culture, it is known as a sacred water purifier. When salamander is in peril, we are on the verge of ecosystem collapse. In the past few years, we've begun to notice that salamanders are dying in the same conditions that are killing spring salmon. One thing has halted these die-off events in recent years: wildfire smoke. This brings forward the question, how can we use prescribed fire, cultural burning, and managed wildfire to contribute just enough smoke to the environment to preserve salmon and salamander populations? Long-term research and monitoring will help us answer this question, but we must act soon. Next slide. It is impossible to assess all factors in all situations at once. Humans are simply not capable of processing the level of complexity found in our local ecosystems, let alone at local, state, and national scales in sufficient detail. So our collaborative projects look at about 5 focal species. Focus is not just on the biophysical factors involved, but also the metaphysical. In looking closer at the species selected for this project, their relationship intersects at the huckleberry. Without fire, the huckleberry takes over the understory. Elk cannot access acorns and mushrooms for food. They can only browse the edge of the patch. The owl has no access to the rodent because it cannot get under the excessive brush where they hide. Then when fire comes, the entire stand may burn. Next slide. That which cannot eat the food it evolved to consume becomes unhealthy. High insulation slopes that were once dominated by black oak woodland are now dense, even-aged conifer stands. Closed canopy tan oak conifer forests no longer have an open understory or have been converted to conifer plantation. Meadows are filled in and invasive species dominate our roadsides. Species like the spotted owl are declining, so we are not allowed to burn in our culturally relevant windows. Even when burning will create more food for the rodents and create space for the owl to access their prey. Our forests are unhealthy, as are our people. Good fire can help us turn this around and protect us from the type of fire many refer to as bad. Regardless of our worldviews, fire is not inherently bad. Next slide. We are starting to rethink our management systems. The response workforce has a fire response priority. Some places are ready to be burned when most response resources are busy. Fire adapted community programs can have a resilient landscapes priority. These folks can assist with local response and when conditions are the worst. They may also help when there's opportunity to progress beneficial fire during a wildland fire event. Cultural burning can be revitalized through tribal territories and help maintain socio-ecological resilience. Both fire adapted community and response programs can support cultural fire practitioners upon request. Together, federal, tribal, state, NGO, and private resources can help keep California forests forested. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So if you could, just talk a moment about this innovative amount of funding in the $20 million that the Karuk tribal government helped advocate for within the budget, specifically for tribal forest management and as potential. I just want to give acknowledgement and credit to the Karuk government for making that happen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was really a great pleasure to work with all of you and walking through those discussions. There was a lot of conversation about scaling up some cohesive strategy behaviors and issues like shared stewardship that are currently going on between federal and state agencies and other partners. I just so many people have been founding this storyline, rightly so, on the indigenous aspects of this equation. And so, it was just a really great pleasure to have that conversation to, start to get some funding built into these systems to be able to support the tribal engagement factor, in creating these solutions. It's one-time infusion of funds isn't going to get us to the end of this road, but it's a great start. And in combination with all of those other programs that are invested, I think that we're in a good place to really start leveraging resources and getting good work done.
Thanks so much, Bill. Looking forward to continuing the conversation with you in a moment. So next we'll turn to Chief Tom Porter from Calfire. Now, Chief Porter, I think every Californian knows who Calfire is, and a lot of us consider Calfire, the heroes that run towards the wildland fire when all of us are running away. But less people know that the whole name of Calfire is the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And at the same time, though, have inherited an agency that maybe in previous decades, wasn't as engaged in this notion of good fire. So it's really valuable to have your perspective, and would be great to hear sort of at the highest level, where you're at as a leader in Calfire on this notion of good fire, and how and where do you think we're at on this journey of getting it back on the landscape, particularly with Calfire's leadership.
Thank you for having me back, Secretary. And I think it's been about 2 years since we had a chance to meet at the speakers series anyway. And I'm so happy that we're talking about kind of the proactive approach and what good fire means to the future of California. It's so important. And as also the state's forester, I'm California state forester, I interact with my counterparts across the nation. And not interestingly, but very true, is that every single one of us is dealing with all of these same issues in different scale and different ways, but the indigenous component is there across the board, as well as the known need for more action to be taken. And so we aren't in this alone, which is great to know. We have partners across the nation. And you've also probably heard me say, and for the audience, if you haven't heard me say, I'm going to say it now. My firm belief is that every single acre in California can and will burn someday. And I say that adamantly because I've seen desert burn. I've seen the asbestos forest, redwood burn. It's all going to burn someday on that critical time when it can happen. So we need to be looking at ways to put fire on the ground under our own terms and reduce the impacts of large and damaging fires, as you mentioned at the beginning of this episode. 6 of the largest fires in historic record have occurred within the last, within this year. 6 of the 7 largest fires in the state's history have happened just this year. And all 6 of them started within a 12-month period of each other. It's a crazy thing to think that within 12 months, we'd have 6 of the largest fires in the state's history. And so what does that mean going forward? What's good fire in the larger fire environment? What's good fire in the prescribed environment? I think we would hope that all prescribed fire is going to be good fire. But we also need to look at ways to maximize what good fire comes out of wildfires. And this is a landscape level issue. It's not just forest, it's chaparral, it's oak woodland, it's range. All of the wildlands of California have adapted in some way to some frequency of fire, as Craig was mentioning earlier. And we need to find ways to get back within that departure that we've been in for too long and get back to a space where land is burning on a natural basis, and seed beds and animals and humans that live in and around those areas can live with and flourish under those conditions. So what is the state doing? We have fully embraced an all of the above approach. And when I say all of the above, I'm talking about the areas in the backcountry, the landscape level I was talking about, forest, chaparral, woodlands, and range. Then doing that through prescribed fire in the future, hopefully wholly, but there are some management activities that we need to do in some areas to get fire safely back into those areas without doing stand replacement type of burns. Then in the WUI, the wildland urban interface, and the intermix, where we have structures, homes, infrastructure, we need to reduce the fuels to reduce the impacts of fires within those areas. And so what we're trying to do in those 2 cases is reduce the intensity of fire as it comes into a community. And then defensible space, making sure people have clearance around their homes, and the right type of vegetation at the right spacing to not carry fire into the structure, reduced ember cast, and then the ember cast piece we need to mitigate through structure hardening, home hardening, you've heard it called as well. And those are the things that we're going to do, all of the above approach. The governor's budget has funding and programs that are under development or already in place that will be doing all of those things together. So those are the elements, and I will just close with the simple fact, as I believe it, every acre can and will burn someday, and this is the path forward so we can live with fire.
Thanks so much, Tom. And I'll note that Calfire is one of many entities that's working on a prescribed fire strategy for the state that we're going to talk about in a little while. And that's going to be a strategy that we're going to share in draft form for input from everybody. As I think, let's see, it was probably Craig noted, this is not, if we're going to actually reintroduce good fire at the scale we need to, we're going to need everybody on board, federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies, so many entities. And so we're working to develop a strategy around scaling up this concept of good fire. So thanks, Tom. Looking forward to continuing the conversation in just a moment. So we're real lucky to be joined by Senator Bill Dodd. Senator Dodd, as you know, has taken the lead on a lot of the consequential legislation focused on wildfire safety and wildfire resilience in recent years, including addressing or increasing accountability of our utilities to reduce wildfire threats. And he was at it again this year and just got a bill signed by the governor that's really, I think, as Laina said, going to be quite consequential to the discussion here today. So Senator, welcome, and would appreciate your thoughts on this topic and a view from the state capitol.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for inviting me to join this group of panelists. And also to say a few words about my bill, SB 332, pertaining to prescribed fire liability. I have to say that everyone on this panel has contributed something to my understanding about prescribed fire and have also helped me to shape the final version of the bill. But I do have to give a special shout out to Laina, Quinn, Davidson, who was actually the primary force in getting SB 332 introduced in the first place, and also for providing expert information on the whole subject of good fire and getting more of it. Now, it was about a year ago that Laina and I participated on a panel about wildfire prevention and protection. Laina made an excellent presentation on the public benefits of prescribed fire and why California needed to up its game in treating more of our wildlands. My staff and I followed up with Laina, and she reminded us of a relatively new state law that established a state prescribed burn certification program. And that was authored by my former colleague, Senator Hannah Beth Jackson. And pursuant to that law, the state fire marshal had just completed the development of the certification standards, and the training of the so-called burn bosses was about to begin. The fly in the ointment, however, was that professional burn bosses and property owners who hire burn bosses were very reluctant to engage in applying fire to land due to the inability to get liability insurance. I learned that no matter how well trained a burn boss is, no matter how well a burn boss adhered to both the training protocols and all burn permit conditions, they would be held to a standard of simple negligence if, in the unlikely event, a controlled burn escaped its prescribed boundaries and suppression was needed. This could be costly to the burn boss and the property owners, and without insurance, very few folks were willing to take the risk. Research on the subject of liability revealed that states that instituted a gross negligence standard rather than simple negligence standard of liability achieved significantly greater amounts of prescribed burning. For example, Florida is burning as much as 2 million acres annually, and 4 other states have burned substantially more than any simple negligence state like California, and there is little, if any, escape fire in any of these states. Thus, SB 332 was born, which clearly sets forth the strict standards a burn boss and property owner must meet in exchange for being held to a higher gross negligence standard for fire suppression costs. As we work to pass SB 332, Bill Tripp and Craig Thomas helped educate me about the Native American cultural practice of using prescribed fire to not only reduce wildfire intensity and frequency, but also ecologically improve our forests. Unfortunately, cultural burners are subject to the same liability and suppression costs if there were escape from fires they managed as well. And I certainly agreed with Bill, Craig, and the Karuk tribe that cultural burners be held to the same standards as other trained individuals. And I was happy to add provisions of SB 332 to that, which protected them as well. This now brings us full circle to this incredible $1.5 billion investment that we've heard about from Governor Newsom and the legislature that we agreed to make for wildfire and forest resilience, which includes significant allocations for prescribed fire. Chief Porter and his amazing team of forest and fire professionals certainly have a big job ahead of them to use the resources they've just been handed to treat tens of thousands of more acres of land, in addition to the growing amount of firefighting they must perform every single year. So I want to thank Governor Newsom for signing SB 332. And my sincere hope is that with its enactment, prescribed fire becomes a more readily available tool, which will be used by private landowners, county fire safe councils, and others to supplement our Calfire efforts. And in conclusion, I want to thank everyone for their help on this bill and look forward to continuing work with all of you on the many more things that we can do together to prevent and protect our communities and forests. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dodd. Really exciting. And it's our commitment to actually breathe life into that bill that just passed and work with Laina and so many others to actually get more available burn bosses. My colleague James is going to bring the rest of our panelists back onto the screen for a discussion. And I'll just note that, Laina, you really caught my attention when you said that you've got that one burn boss that has to travel all around Northern California to actually be able to facilitate these burns. Is it your vision, if this legislation is successful, that there'll be a broader supply of these burn bosses? And I guess by burn boss, we mean the person that has the know-how to supervise one of these events?
Yeah, we're talking about someone who has the skill to both plan and lead prescribed burns. And definitely the vision would be to have many, many more of those folks available and community-based so that we have that flexibility. You know, burn windows tend to be narrow, so we need to have people in our communities who can lead this work.
That's helpful. You know, great questions coming in. And I remind participants, if you want to ask a question, tap on the Q&A button and we're going to get to a bunch of these. First question is just whether this Caples prescribed fire up by Caples Lake had a role in controlling the Caldor fire. The Caldor fire was the one, of course, that burned from essentially, Sly Park up the 50 all the way over the crest into South Lake Tahoe. Chief Porter or any of your colleagues want to talk a little bit about what the Caples prescribed fire was or any role it played?
Yeah, I think in general, the Caples was very helpful, and the fire burned through a lot of the fuels project work that you just mentioned, Secretary. But what happened when it hit those fuels projects, and we've got to remember, these are not fire breaks. They're not going to stop a running head fire, but they will reduce the intensity of fire. And on the edges of the fire, meaning not the flanks or the heel where the fire is going away from or flanking, they're very effective in reducing the fire intensity so that firefighters can actually do some work in those areas and protect homes and lives. So that's what we're looking for across the landscape. These large holes where fire can't go into the canopy and perform stand replacing kind of fire. And so Caples was one of those projects that was very helpful, as well as a lot of the other fuels project work that was done up the 50 corridor and all around South Lake Tahoe as well.
Thanks so much. So Erica asks a good question. Has there been any effort to prioritize areas for good fire treatment or prescribed burns? How would landowners know whether there are plans for their area? Maybe Craig, get you back into the conversation. Somebody's listening. How would they know if where they live is even a candidate for this type of prescribed fire?
Well, one is there's multiple collaboratives across all the national forest lands and in the WUI communities. I live in El Dorado County. There's a county fire safe council. I think there's 23 community fire safe councils. So that's the place. And if you really want, besides doing things like getting familiar with Calfire's website and thinking about your defensible space requirements that are law and also a darn good idea. But those county fire safe councils and the local community groups and the operation that Laina is heading up, a prescribed burn association piece, is super helpful to help, people understand what are the rules, what are the tools, what do I need to know, how do I protect my home, how do I protect the road I live on in case there's a fire coming and we need to get engines in and people out. That's what fire safe councils do. It's a great place to get involved in that.
Thanks. Laina, anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I would just say, yeah, get involved with your local prescribed burn association. And I think the fire safe councils, if they have a community wildfire protection plan, it may have projects or priorities identified for your area. It's pretty unlikely that someone would have a plan for a prescribed burn on your property and you wouldn't know it. Like if you're working with Calfire and their vegetation management program, you would be working with them on a project, and same with the prescribed burn association. So
that's great. Well, one thing I've learned in this job is, we have such diversity of landscape types across California. And so there's a question in here around, do we use these strategies across landscapes? Are there differences in terms of the applicability of prescribed fire to conifer forests versus chaparral, for example, which is the dominant native landscape in Southern California? Craig, Laina, or Bill, Tom, thoughts on, can this be applied to chaparral, or how do we assess the applicability of good fire?
I'll just add that those systems are very different. They've responded to an uncharacteristic fire intent intensity by moving into another vegetation class, which is more fire prone. It's been somewhat of a misunderstanding for chaparral systems that we're trying to get everybody lined up. And supportive of right around communities, we all understand that people are going to be the priority, home protection and people. But out in the wildlands and those chaparral systems, they are absolutely magnificent systems. When you get in the middle of an intact one, it's incredible. It has its own management regime that needs to be very thoughtful. When you're in a coniferous forest versus a rainforest, those different vegetation types burn at different intensities and at different scales. So we have 30 years of information at minimum about how we should operate in these landscapes. And Bill will correct me and say, no, we actually have probably 10, 20,000 years of information. So we need to pay attention to that.
I think that also, Mr. Secretary, that it's important to get that information out. Maybe not 30,000 years of it, but really what the current science on that is, because I have colleagues in Southern California, for example, that when we bring up these bills, they're quick to point out that this may not be the answer for them. And so we are one big state. We have to look out not just after the areas that we serve, but our entire state. And so really making clear those issues and how the money would be spent both in the north and the south, and what activities could be used both in the north and the south, I think is important to keep on top of our mind as we move forward.
Yeah, it is not a one size fits all situation. Chief.
Yeah, I wanted to speak, and I don't know the origin of all of you, but I do count my origin as San Diego for 5 generations, and really grew up and spent the bulk of my career in Southern California. And while I do agree with what Craig just mentioned, that there are different prescriptions that would be appropriate for different landscapes and different types of vegetation across the state. We do have that departure data that Craig mentioned. And even in the chaparral ecosystem, we are outside of the departure of regularly occurring fire. Our indigenous peoples in Southern California are seeing areas where there are chaparral covered landscapes that haven't seen fire in a long time and probably do need to see fire. And thanks to Senator Dodd and others, SB 901 for Jackson, SB 1260 reaffirmed what is already in our programmatic environmental impact statement, that we will not do and can't engage in type conversion. That means what vegetation naturally would be on the landscape as the climax species needs to be that vegetation that's on the landscape after and in years to come downstream from doing any project work. So we're very happy with all of that language, and thank you, Senator, for working through that with us and making sure that we're looking out for the future of our landscape as well.
Thanks. 2 questions related to housing and communities and how prescribed fire works around them. Joshua asks, how does the presence of housing, even sparsely placed housing, complicate the use of prescribed burns? And then Kathy asks, even in the wildland urban interface of the East Bay, people are interested in whether controlled burning or cultural burning can work. So as fire practitioners, how do you navigate prescribed fire around nearby in communities?
Well, I know we're doing a lot of that up here in the Klamath Mountains, where we're burning, right up to the edge of homes, both with cultural fire and prescribed fire. And in the summers, a lot of times we're forced to do the same thing with wildfires. It's just the reality of our world out here. And so, that fire environment is that fire environment, and we're going to have to choose our fire. But traditionally, colored people lived in wooden houses, permanent structures set in place for millennia. And so it's a matter of figuring out that landscape. And, in some cases, at least in the northern part of the state, the places that are, most of the area within 2 miles of where a home is, which would have a traditional focus on getting quite frequent fire engaged, has all kind of converted to this mixed evergreen environment, where a lot of that landscape would have had more of an oak woodland component. It would have pine patches, other shade intolerant species mixed in that would enable you to do more patch burning. So you can say burn underneath some pine trees in the first 2 days of sun in February, maybe burn under some whitethorn after 3 to 4 days, then use those 2 features to compartmentalize a burn in some black oak. And then you've set up your high insulation slope to be able to do some fall burning as a transition to conifer and tan oak. And so understanding how those little micro environments interact with each other and what that burn timing is becomes important.
Fascinating. It shows how complex the knowledge is too there.
Yeah.
Chief, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, Bill is exactly right. And from the practitioner perspective, there are ways to deal with any situation. The biggest challenge, I believe, is the acceptance of the people that are in those homes that we want to bring fire around, and the communities nearby. Acceptance.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. We haven't talked about smoke and well, one, the air quality, the regional air quality boards. Craig mentioned that the California Air Resources Board that protects us against air pollution is now part of this broad coalition. But Laina, maybe over to you in terms of what's your take on sort of the trend of community acceptance? And then you talked about burn windows. Can you talk a little bit about what that is in relation to this air quality issue?
Yeah, sure. I mean, starting with the community acceptance, I think we're at a moment in California where I think the communities are almost to the point of demanding more on this, more of these efforts and wanting to be involved. And that's what we're seeing with the prescribed burn associations, with the policy work, with the media. People are kind of sick of sitting around and waiting for their communities to burn down. So they want to be involved. I'd say there's great public acceptance. You're always going to have those squeaky wheels of people who don't support it. But the overwhelming consensus is that we need more of this work. And that's clear to all of us who work in it. And, burn windows, when I mentioned burn windows, I was really talking about weather windows and, the fact that sometimes you'll have a 2-day period of time where conditions are just right for prescribed fire, and you need to be able to be flexible and jump on those windows. And when you're waiting for resources or for a burn boss or for, people to come from out of the area, that can be a real challenge. So part of that burn window is the air quality consideration. And what I see is that our air quality districts around California are actually very supportive of prescribed fire and understand its importance. And, I have a great relationship with my local air district, but what I do see also is that they are limited in capacity. We have one person in our district who processes permits for 3 counties, and she's bogged down. And sometimes it's a slow process, and that narrows our burn windows too. So I think we need a lot more attention to air quality, more capacity there. What can we give the district so they can help us? I think is the question we should be asking.
That's helpful. And I think that there was some funding in this budget to actually support capacity at the air quality boards. And that was the question Dana asked, which is how do we remove barriers? But I hear you saying, Laina, that it's not the lack of acceptance or opposition from the air quality regulators. It's really helping build their capacity to facilitate this. I see my colleague, Jessica Morris, has come on screen. She probably has something to share with us.
No, I just wanted to add, kind of to stitch together where a lot of these threads are funded in the budget so that we'll actually start seeing the momentum, including $2 million to the Air Resources Board for local air districts to be able to expand their education and the tools they have to give larger air windows. We have $2 million to the UC Extension to fund more amazing leaders like Laina to be able to have more fire advisors on the ground. As Bill discussed, we have $20 million for collaborations with tribes to be able to invest in cultural resources and tribal management. We have $24 million for workforce development, which should help train and expand these burn bosses. We have funding for the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program, which invested in these prescribed fire collaboratives that Laina was mentioning to ensure that those which have been really successful are now going to be invested in statewide, and that $20 million for the prescribed fire liability program to be able to close off that to be able to complement Senator Dodd's bill to ensure that those burn bosses can get the tools they need. And in addition to all of that, all of our grant dollars, whether it's from our conservancies, state parks, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Calfire, all of these dollars for active projects on the ground include and prioritize prescribed fire. And the last very nuanced detail we put in is that for much of our funding, especially for conservancies and state parks, we expanded the longevity of the state dollars. So rather than expiring after 2 years, those dollars will expire after 7 years, which allows those land managers to be able to conduct prescribed fire because sometimes those weather windows take a while to be able to get. So I just wanted to kind of knit all of that together since Laina was mentioning that funding, and so that we can see that all of this amazing work that Bill and Craig and Laina have really put on the ground, that we are now building on that and expanding it to be able to deliver these results at scale.
Yeah, thanks. And it's hard to overestimate the impact of this $1.5 billion investment. this is really 10 times the investment that, in essence, that we've made in recent years. And it's been really thoughtfully allocated thanks to the legislature and folks like you're talking to today, Jessica, Patrick, others. And so a lot of this progress is going to be made as this funding finds its way out the door to attack these different problems. Craig, we have, and maybe Bill, we have a question from Andrew. It says, does CAL FIRE have any plans to assist and coordinate private landowners in scaling up the size of prescribed fire projects? It seems like the average size of a single burn is still quite small. And Craig, I recall in your initial discussion, you said that, really one big need is to scale up. So how can you take smaller size projects and make them potentially bigger? What's the secret to scaling up?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think one of the key pieces that is falling into place is the unity of purpose and commitment between the agencies and others, that is to bring, when we're on public land, Forest Service ground, and we're talking about burning for longer periods of time. Caples is an example of that. It's El Dorado County's pristine water supply. So support for longer burns takes logistical support, workforce support. It takes, social license and all of the above, and a workforce that can stay sustained on a project for weeks at a time to get us to the scale we need to get to. And I'm talking about where I tend to spend my time. I love the work that Bill and Laina do, where it's just, getting communities used to and getting a drip torch in the community's hands and helping them understand what the fire history has been and the cultural history has been on these landscapes. I'm thinking about Forest Service land now that needs, in a community, adjacent to a community, we need all hands on deck. There isn't that workforce developed. We all want it. We're pushing from multiple angles at the federal level to expand that capacity. But I think Tom will agree that things work better when we're aligned. And it's great to have both the previous CAL FIRE director and our current director, Tom, supporting expanded burning. It's not going to happen on the big scale in the Sierra Nevada where I work and live. Not going to happen without that collaborative effort sustained forever.
And there are places that are scaling up and doing that. The landscape Tom is working in, or Craig's working in right now, is doing that, as well as with the Western Climate Restoration Partnership. Our kind of mantra was, we had to build some trust. So we started small, then we're looking to replicate, adapt, and scale up. And so we started with a 5,500 acre project. We're planning our next, 13,000 acre project, and then they start scaling up over the next 5 to 8 years, to 50,000 acre projects. This year at the Klamath River Prescribed Fire Training Exchange, we have over 170 people burning at every available window starting October 4th and extended for 7 weeks into the fall, burning whatever we got, broadcast, piles, whatever it is, where we have a window and we have all the things in place, we're getting it done. We have 170 participants at this event, 5 federal agencies, 4 state agencies, 5 tribes, 8 universities, 19 different, NGOs and several private organizations and contractors engaged. And so, it takes people to get this work, and to see everyone be able to come together like that is just an awesome model to replicate.
Thanks, Bill. A lot of questions about what it takes to be a burn boss. I think you've got a lot of intrigued potential burn bosses. Laina, what does it look like? I mean, is it certification? How long?
Yeah, great question. And folks can email me too if they want to get on my list, just so you know that. Look me up and I have a list going. But this burn boss certification is not entry level. So it's not something that if you're just getting into prescribed fire, you're going to become a burn boss right away. This is something that takes a depth of experience and knowledge, and the actual course that we've been hosting has a lot of prerequisites. So you need to show that you have a lot of experience in igniting and leading ignitions on prescribed burns, that you understand fire behavior, that you have leadership experience, things like that. So you can show all that, you take the course, and then there's an additional process after that for becoming certified. So it's pretty involved, and as it should be. A burn boss is an important job that comes with a lot of responsibility, but please do email me if you want to know more.
That's great. So we have literally dozens of questions that have been asked that are ultimately going to remain unanswered for this discussion, simply because we are almost out of time. But I want to ask our colleague Patrick Wright to explain the next step in engagement if you are interested in plugging into this movement. Patrick leads the Governor's Office Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. And one of its committed actions is to work with all of these parties you've heard about today on a unified prescribed fire strategy. So James, can we bring up the slide? And Patrick, can you talk a little bit about what the strategy is and how people can plug in?
Sure, thanks, Wade. What you've all heard in particular from Laina is that we're in a transition period. We're scaling up. You heard from Jessica on all the budget items that are out there, the new legislation sponsored by Senator Dodd. So what the task force is doing is pulling all that together into one comprehensive strategy for prescribed fire that'll lead the way between now and 2025. It has ambitious but achievable targets for the feds, for the state, for locals, and for others that are performing prescribed fire. And it really works towards this alignment issue to make sure federal, state, local, and tribal agencies are all working together. Provides a forum to make sure we have the workforce, we have the training, we have the budget, we have the skill set. So to find out more about that, as you can see on your screen, you can go to the Forest Management Task Force website. You can get a copy of this draft plan that's out. We're having a workshop next week on Tuesday to walk the task force and interested public through it. And we hope to issue a final plan in about a month or so. So look forward to that, and we certainly welcome your comments.
Thanks so much, Patrick. So near the closing, as maybe give you each a last word, and Patrick identified the time frame of 2025 for that strategy. I'm interested in asking you, what does it look like in 2025 if we're successful in this effort? How have things changed? What does it look like on the landscape? And be interested in everybody's just a few sentences from whoever would like to share that vision.
I'll offer, Wade, that a much broader base of unified purpose, and we're heading there. That's the key thing. Bill mentioned it. That's what we're all trying to do, is to get people together, dealing with both climate impacts and also the need for expanded fire. They're one and the same. And we need that unity in California. That's what we're all about. That's what we should remain all about.
Thanks, Craig.
It's like I could follow up on that in saying that, one of the things that I'm really in it for is to revitalize our indigenous knowledge, practice, and belief systems. We have so much knowledge locked up in our ceremonial regalia and our baskets and our songs and our stories that have been around for millennia, and they all have clues to get us to where we need to be. And so just creating a continuum to pull that out and put it back in play is where I'm hoping we're heading.
Thank you, Bill.
I'll jump in. And, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is just the incredible focus on acres that everyone seems to be, there's kind of a real focus on acres and projects. And I think we need to focus on people. These next 5 years are going to be instrumental in trying to think about how we train a workforce who can do this. How do we carve out space for non-traditional fire practitioners, for people who don't work for fire agencies? It's time to broaden the way we think about who fire experts are and who can be involved. So invest in people, not just acres.
Well put.
Yeah. I would tag on to that with the practitioners growing and in place. We also have 40 million people in California that need to have, as part of their popular Californian culture, the understanding of the need for this activity on the landscape and good smoke as well as good fire. We were closer to that in 1970 during kind of that heyday of the build of our modern day fire use or prescribed burning. And then from there, work toward a place where we're closer to the people who were here well before most of us on this call or on this, who settled here and changed practices from the 150, maybe 75, somewhere in their 1,000 people that were here when settlement occurred. We need to get back to that kind of a landscape approach and understanding of what we're trying to do.
And finally, Jessica.
Thanks, Secretary Crowfoot. Just really wanted to emphasize that our goal is to return to prescribed fire as a major management tool. That while there's a lot of areas that we need to go in first by hand, as Craig was differentiating between first entry, but then to be able to get to a point where we are then long-term managing California's landscape with the natural fire ecologies, integrating that cultural and traditional ecological knowledge, integrating this as a driver of workforce and something that Californians can be proud of. They can be proud to stand back and see low intensity fire on the landscape that is benefiting our ecology and keeping our communities safe. So I am just so grateful for all of the experts on the call today, because these people are really the ones who are driving our policies and initiatives. What you have seen the state do is a result of listening to these experts and then translating that into investments that are going to scale the vision that they've been pushing for the last 30 years. So really grateful and hope that we can get to a point where we are achieving Bill's vision and getting back to that beautifully managed landscape modeled after millennia of tribal examples.
Well put. Craig, Laina, Bill, Tom, thank you for your leadership. And also for those who have tuned in today, thank you for your engagement and your leadership. I know that there are a lot of you that are out there actually doing this work on the ground and are part of and leading the movement. So it will take all of us to actually shift the paradigm. Thanks so much for tuning in and hope that you'll be able to join us for future speaker series events. Have a great day and have a great week.